So my first speaker, and a reminder, Jobs Expo, if you're so inclined on social media, you can do hashtag Jobs Expo. An amazing selection of speakers today to help you hopefully on your career path. And my first speaker on stage is Fiona Fennell, and she works with Innopharma, and she's talking about why consider validation as a career. Now, I'm not even going to try and explain it, but I was just chatting to her there, and she was saying about connecting to the pharma and the medical industry, and validation being doing what you say you're doing, but so much more besides that. So, and we joked earlier that it was like being called for a flight. Will Fiona Fennell please come to the plane? Ladies and gents, will you give our first speaker a round of applause? Fiona Fennell.
Thanks, guys. Can you hear me okay? So I'd start by saying, thank you. If validation isn't something that you're aware of, I will explain what validation involves, and I'll explain a little bit, I suppose, about how we train people for validation specifically. So that's probably better if I stand like this. However, if validation still isn't something you're interested in by the end of the talk, it's still worth listening to the talk, because I definitely will give you some tips as regards interviewing for the pharmaceutical and the medtech sectors in particular. Because I'm sure some of you are interested in that, the career opportunities that sector offers. So we'll get started. Now, if there's anything specific that you would like me to address, feel free, put your hand up. I'll keep an eye out. Ask questions by all means. And if you have more questions at the end, I'll allow time for that as well. But could I just ask out of interest, is there anyone here who knows a little bit about validation and genuinely thinks, yeah, that's a job I'm interested in doing? Okay. So at least I know I'm starting from the base level there. And I'll continue, but as I said, feel free to jump in if you have particular questions. They don't have to be about validation specifically. They might be about how to prepare yourself well for a career in engineering or science generally, or they might be about the sector, the pharmaceutical, biopharma, or the medical device sectors, or indeed you might have a question about Innopharma. So feel free to ask. Okay, so I'll talk through in the talk, I'll try and address what is validation and explain that to you a little bit. As Ruth said, it's, I suppose, the means by which companies can prove that they're doing what they say they're doing as regards their processes and their equipment and their manufacturing in order to protect a patient, but more importantly, that they can provide documentation as evidence of that. I will talk about why it's performed and the situations that drive the demand for validation talent that we have in the country at the moment, and unfortunately we're not able to meet it. I'll try and make you interested in it, because I think it is an interesting area that you don't hear an awful lot about, maybe at third level, and it's not something you hear about until you go looking for jobs and you say, oh, everybody seems to want them, but what do they do? Also, I'll give you an idea of the competencies that we think are important to be effective and have a good career in validation. So most jobs come with, I'm sure you've seen a job description, a list of responsibilities, and at the bottom, a person profile, where the company attempts to give you an outline of the type of person they want in terms of qualifications and also approach and attitude. When you go for interviews generally, what you'll find are that the knowledge and skills are one thing that may or may not be actually asked a lot about, because it's taken as a given at times, but based on your CV, you have an idea of the factual knowledge that you have from college, because validation is a job that has an ethical dimension, so your integrity is important. And people forget that even how they view themselves is something that interviewers want to see. So what's your self-concept? What's your level of confidence in your own effectiveness, which we call self-efficacy? So I'll go down through, that might give you an insight into why you're asked some questions at interview that seem a little bit unrelated to the job, and maybe prepare you better to formulate answers to those ahead of time. As a general rule, if you're heading to interview, you should probably have an idea of 80% of what you're going to say before you get to that interview. The questions can be quite easy to predict based on the job description, but if you haven't a clue, you need to talk to somebody who can help you predict those questions. Prepare your answers well ahead of time. And also, I'll explain just how we purpose train for validation. It's an interesting area because when you see the jobs and apply for them, the response a lot of people will get is, sorry, you can't work in validation because you have no validation experience. And you'll, logically ask, well, how do I get that experience? And they'll say, we'll work in validation. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. You can't get the job without the experience, but you can't get the experience without the job. So we found a way of safely training people within what we call a problem-based learning environment. So it's learning by experience, but in a safe environment where we have all of the equipment that you'll see in an oral solid dose manufacturing setting in small scale, and we allow you to qualify that equipment, etc., so that you learn how to do the job, but with very short, effective feedback loops from validation managers from industry who can tell you what you need to do differently and how to improve. So I'll tell you more about the program itself towards the end. So a little bit about Innopharma. Every company has a story. You have a story that you need to tell well at interview. I won't go through all of these steps, but going back to 2007, Innopharma started and we developed what are called process analytical technologies. They sit on top of tablet manufacturing, for example, and they carry out functions like particle size and characterizing particles so that you know your processes are working effectively and they're giving you attributes in your product that you need. We developed those systems, and in tandem, we also set up an applied science college because we realized sometimes people can do a basic degree but aren't prepared or industry ready necessarily until they have a bit more information about what's involved in working in industry. So all our lecturers are people who've worked in industry, in large multinational or maybe even small companies, but have worked in GMP and FDA regulated companies and can tell you how to interpret the information so that you're prepared for actually working in that area. So the two sides of the business grew gradually and in tandem with one another, and they having both, because we're researching our own technology, we needed to have a small scale lab, as I mentioned earlier, and because we're dealing with customers every day, obviously they are the companies and we're training for them, so they're pharmaceutical med tech companies who are telling us what skills they need in the personnel that they're going to hire. And we try and embed into our programs the subjects like aseptic control or like technical writing that are really important in order to be able to conduct yourself effectively and not present risk when you arrive at the door of these companies. So by 2016, we realized by bringing these parts of our companies together, we were actually capable of providing, as I said, a safe environment to train validation engineers, which we do in Dublin. So people come into us for 3 months and they're trained on process, equipment and cleaning validation. And then we introduce them into multinational environments from there, but we're responsible for their continuous professional development. The catch-22 a little bit with validation is once you have experience, it can be easy to paint yourself into a corner quite quickly because it's quite intricate to do your job well and people will want you to keep doing it. So you might find that you're been, I suppose, narrowed within validation itself, and we try and make sure that doesn't happen by opening up other opportunities to our staff. And also after 6 months probation as our permanent employees, all our staff are eligible to do one of our master's programs for free. We're just there at the corner, so if you're interested in any of the level 6, 7 or 8 programs we deliver in Cork, but also we do master's programs which you can do as a blended learning or a remote option like master's in data analytics. We obviously, it's a lifelong learning journey within Innopharma and we make sure our own staff are part of that. So what is validation? It's a broad set of activities. It's multidimensional, so it combines science and engineering. And these activities, as I said, are here to make sure we have documented evidence that we're in control of our manufacturing and we make our product as safely as possible because at the end of all of these products is a patient. And like a doctor with a do no harm philosophy, we want to make sure that whatever we do with our drugs or our devices or our delivery systems, that they're not going to in any way harm a patient. And not just do that, but also have evidence to back that up so that we can be audited by bodies like the FDA and they can verify that we're in what we call a validated state. So in other words, all our processes are working within the controls that they should be to deliver safety to a patient. So we do it, first of all, because it's a regulatory requirement. So when products are approved, we are committing that we will manufacture those products in, as I said, a controlled and stable way. There's variability in every process, so we need to have ways of correcting that variability and preventing further variability. So again, that's all part of what we do in validation, is studying the processes very carefully, or your cleaning process, and it can take longer sometimes to clean your equipment after making a product than it does actually make the product in the first place. And we're trying to protect both our employees and our patients, as I said, and our employees because increasingly, the type of drugs that are being manufactured are becoming more potent during the manufacturing process. So we have responsibilities, and validation is a responsible job. It's a highly relevant job because at the end of it, you'll be, I suppose, successful or otherwise, depending on the effects of the patient. So, nowadays with the new types of drugs coming onto the market, we've, I suppose, an opportunity to really add a lot of value in Ireland because our quality systems and our quality record as a manufacturing country is extremely good. And more, as a result, companies are starting up their biopharma processes in here in Ireland because they believe in our quality record. So it's relevant because there's demand for validation as a function, because anything that represents change or expansion creates demand for validation skills and validation work, and that's a lot of work. So, for instance, before any product is actually I suppose, shipped out from a company, it could take 2 to 3 years to actually get the company into a validated state in order for that product to be able to be sent to a patient. It also requires a lot of rigor. So if you're somebody that likes to get things right, that is really oriented around the detail and enjoys spending time on something to get it right rather than just doing something for the sake of it, it could be a job that you'd enjoy. It's a responsible job because ultimately you are signing off on consignments to patients and on, I suppose, be it packaging or warehousing or any of the functions that support the manufacturing, they all need to be validated. And it's your signature and date at the bottom of that document. So, as I said, there's an ethical dimension, and also it's a job where there's a lot of job satisfaction because you know exactly what you are responsible for, and you need to value your signature and only sign when you feel this is consistent and compliant. There's a lot of range in in validation jobs also because manufacturing processes and environments themselves are becoming more and more complex. So you'll find that you learn a lot about areas you mightn't have covered in college. If you're an engineer, you learn a lot about sterilization and microbes and toxicology. And if you're a scientist, you learn a lot about, I suppose, calibration and instrumentation and how to qualify equipment and commission equipment and make sure equipment is delivering the end product that you want. So there's a lot of variety there. And I suppose, any environment where you're also analysing risk, you have to take into account a lot of different factors. So your systems thinking becomes very well developed. What do we validate? I'm not going to read out that slide. There's a lot of information on it, but pretty much anything that's going to have an impact on the product. And that is everything when you're dealing in a biopharma plant. That's the air, around the product, any equipment that has product contact in particular, but it's how people behave as well, that people are garbing up properly. You're the custodian of all of that good practice, or good manufacturing practice as we call it in the industry. So why I think, you may, if you're trying to identify, I suppose, why, or if you are or not suitable for validation, here's just certain things that might be worth thinking about. Number one, are you just a naturally curious person? Asking good questions is the main strength that you have in validation to be effective. And that's not always straightforward when problems won't be as defined as they might have been when you were in third level and doing your courses, etc. In college, you did a subject, you probably did it for a term, you were the next subject, and you mightn't have had much of an opportunity to join the dots between different subjects. But in validation, you very much get to do that. You work on multidisciplinary teams, so you need to be good, if you're an engineer, at understanding the language of scientists and understanding how to talk to them and collaborate, and vice versa. If you're a scientist, you need to understand what are the heuristics and how engineers make decisions, because you're there to collaborate and make decisions together. So you need strong reasoning skills, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. You need to be a good communicator. You need to like dealing with people. So you're interfacing across lots of the different departments in order to get your project done and in order to assess risk effectively, because most things in manufacturing impact something else. So you need to think down the cycle and back up the cycle to figure out maybe what's causing a problem. You might have to do a root cause analysis of that, or you might have to think further down the line. Right, if we standardize all our packaging, for example, in pharmaceutical, it makes it easier to run our lines and maybe gives us greater capacity. But if we go down the line as far as an actual dispensing technician and a pharmacist, and if every pharma company decides to package their drugs in white boxes, that makes the dispensing technician's job quite difficult, and more likely they're going to make mistakes. So you can standardize, but only up to a point. It's a bit of a Goldilocks effect in validation. It's knowing what's too little and knowing what's too much, and setting the criteria for what's acceptable. So sensibility-wise, we need a certain approach, and that's possibly not something you're even aware of. You might even have been born with a certain approach to work, or you might have been brought up by your parents to have particular values that don't become obvious until you join the workforce. But to interview well, you do need to be aware and able to articulate those. So I'll give you a few hints as to the ones that are useful for pharma and medtech. Okay, so we need the right mix of skills. It isn't just that we want people who are technically good, and it doesn't mean you have to have a 1-1 degree, by the way, to be technically good. You know, the 1-1, 2-1s really don't matter that much once you have your degree. But from a hard skills point of view, so the technical skills that we'd like to see, definitely good quantitative reasoning, that you understand how machines are calibrated, how to produce test results that are reliable, verifiable, and how to develop tests that are reproducible. You need to have a good head in your shoulder as regards risk management and be able to spot what presents risk, be it to people or to a process or to a product. And that might be something that you do even at home when you're minding, you know, your siblings, or when you're doing the sports that you do. You know, you're doing a bit of a risk assessment even if you're hosting a soccer match or bringing other people into a building that haven't been in before. So sometimes we're doing these things without realizing it, but it's good to reflect now on, okay, what skills have I developed, not just in college, not just from a technical point of view, you know, in a course that I did, but there's also technical skills I might have gathered in my hobbies as well along the way. Process and project management are useful. Say you've never worked in industry, but you have actually worked as a barista, or you've made somebody a cup of tea in a cafe. That is a process that you were involved with. It was a sequence of steps that you needed to follow, and hopefully everyone was following the same set of steps consistently so that you were in compliance with HACCP, whether you knew that or not at the time, but definitely so that the customer was coming back to you for another cup of coffee another day. So have a think through, okay, was I taught how to clean a piece of equipment? How did I do that? How did I improve how it was cleaned? Did I write a little checklist for the next person coming off the next shift so that I knew I wasn't going to have to inherit a really dirty machine the next time I came on to my shift? What did I do that reduced variability and gave a more consistent product? Even if it was a cup of coffee, if you're thinking along those lines, you're thinking around the right lines, because the processes you're going to see in industry will be more complex, but the idea is there. You want to be able to map out a process, break it down into steps, know what the sequence of steps should be to give the optimum result. So from a systems and data analysis point of view, you know, many of you will have an idea of statistics, hopefully from college if you've done, you know, science or engineering. And what statistics is giving us really is a science of risk. We also have to manage uncertainty, which doesn't maybe happen as easily. But nowadays we are, you know, beginning to have access, you know, very easily to just simple tools like Excel and Minitab. Make sure you know how to do standard deviation on Excel. Minitab you can learn now, you know, on an online program like Udemy. For the sake of spending $15, you know that piece of software, are comfortable with it, that's a big help. But Excel skills, no matter what industry you go into, are never going to do you any harm. So from a soft skills point of view, there's particular ones that are useful for validation, but I think they're probably useful in any engineering or science job these days, because very few jobs in science or engineering now that don't require integrative thinking and collaborating with other people. So here's a few basic ones for you to think about. Maybe think about, where have I, you know, shown and demonstrated these skills in the past, whether I knew it or not at the time. So you're, first of all, cognitive versatility. You need to be good at inductive thinking and deductive thinking. Deductive thinking is probably what you're exposed to more at college, which was you take a theory and you extrapolate from that theory. Induction is probably more what you'll be doing in industry, where you're gathering a lot of facts and information to try and create a hypothesis or theory that you can then test. And that might be something like, for instance, we're bringing in a new product into our manufacturing setting. We want to validate our cleaning for that product. Well, if there's going to be 10 more products, which product do we pick? Right, let's pick the product that is what we call the worst case product. It's the hardest one to clean. And if we set our cleaning regime around that product, then we know it'll be useful and effective for the other products that are actually not as difficult to clean, for example. So I suppose knowing when to adjust your settings, knowing when there's specialist thinking that needs to be applied and you need an expert who has specialist skills, but also knowing when you need to think more as a generalist. So I think in the last slide I had given you a picture of a hedgehog there, and if you can see the fox as well. So technology and science become more and more specialized. And you'll notice that the courses in college that are available, they're also becoming quite specialized. So what we're basically doing is we're producing lots of hedgehogs. So think of it this way: your hedgehog is the person who deep dives into a particular subject area and really, knows that in maybe at nano detail level. And nowadays, people can have complete careers on one cell type, and people are tempted to go into PhDs and become more and more specialized technically. If that is something you think you have to do, hold back, because in industry, we only need so many hedgehogs. We need lots of foxes. So foxes are people who will apply generalist thinking. They'll go and ask all the right questions of maybe many different hedgehogs, and then they'll pull together a rationale that will justify or provide one rationale for how you're going to do something. That does draw from many different expert sets, but takes into account the bigger picture. So your generalist thinking skills in industry are just as valuable as the technical expertise that you're going to gather. So you need to actually develop both, okay? So how you can do that, very simply, starting from today, is if you're a scientist, start getting interested in engineering. Read a book on facilities management. Learn about what a P&ID drawing is. If you're an engineer, go and start reading a little bit so that you understand the biology of your processes, that you know what a microbe is, for example. Because ultimately, once you're in those companies, it's the people who can bring both sets of knowledge together that are going to deliver solutions to the problems that we're going to face, which are becoming more complex, because our manufacturing systems and our manufacturing processes are becoming more integrated, okay? So, going down through this list, social efficacy, how I'd explain that is that I mentioned it earlier. You need to be able to talk to people, communicate, ask questions, and do what we call active listening. So don't just listen to what somebody's saying to you, but maybe also listen to what they're not saying. So if you're asking, for instance, an operator or a system owner about their piece of equipment or how they operate the equipment, and on one hand you have what we call an SOP, or a standard operating protocol or procedure, and you have the person telling you, and you're noticing, okay, there's a gap here. Noticing that there is a gap between what they're saying and what's on the protocol is you identifying a potential risk, and it's you doing your job. So the more comfortable you are, the earlier in your career, asking lots of questions, the better, because that is the main currency of your job and validation. It's asking the right questions and asking them as early as you possibly can. So moving on to contextual judgment. This is a difficult one maybe to explain, but if I explain it this way, and I say to you that in most industries, if a piece of equipment isn't working efficiently, you can simply go in, troubleshoot it and fix it, and great, your process is off and running again. In a highly regulated sector, you can't just go in and be hands-on on a piece of equipment, because remember, we've told the FDA this is how we're running this piece of equipment. So if we're going to make any change at all, we have to be cognizant of that there's a change control system that we need to comply with. So in other words, we can't just change things willy-nilly. We need to have a good explanation of why we're doing that. And we need to take into account a lot of different things. Maybe the classification of the clean room we're in, maybe the classification of the product. As I said earlier, is it our worst case product? We need to tread very carefully if so. So there's a lot of different things that mean you need to take your time in a very specific way. So the more you are someone who mulls over your decisions, doesn't jump to conclusions in your normal everyday life, the better examples you'll have at interview of how you're going to be useful, in a manufacturing setting. Criteria-based decision making. So we all make decisions every day. Sometimes even subconsciously we're making decisions. But you need to be very conscious of the decisions you make in a GMP setting. So you need to view your processes from the point of view of criticality, and that's exactly what we call them. There are particular aspects of our process that we will call critical process parameters, and we need to be aware of those. If you're a scientist, you might be helping to define them in a biopharma company in the first place. And once we know what those parameters are, that's effectively what we're trying to keep a handle of and control. And we do so because we know it's also linked to what we call our critical quality attributes of our product. So we're monitoring these, and as I said, we're setting the acceptance range so that we can keep proving and testing on an ongoing basis that we're doing what we say we're doing, and ideally what we want to do is not just be in compliance, but also continuously improve these processes. So you might think if the regulator comes and they see that you're making lots of change and you're doing lots of investigations, that they might be, oh, what's going on? They don't quite know what they're doing, but the opposite is the case. For instance, we have a structured problem-solving tool that we call a CAPA. So it's a corrective action, preventive action. What that's meant to do is to make sure that there is a report, an investigation carried out, and a report to show that, for us to give evidence that we are noticing anything that may cause a problem before it becomes a problem, hopefully, and we're doing something about that in a way that we've taken into account the classifications, the regulations, the maybe changing regulations. But the more CAPAs, in fact, to a point anyway, an auditor sees, the more they're happy that we're working on our processes, that we're improving them, and that we're taking responsibility for them. So compliance isn't enough. We're now looking for our industry to continuously improve what we're doing and to be more efficient and to be more reliable and have less variance. And if there is variance, that we're able to account for that. So, as I mentioned before, there are people who may be born to be validation engineers, or maybe they were groomed to be before they even knew by their own parents. I'll give you an example. My mother, when she ran our house, it was done on a right first time basis. There was a place for everything was in its place, and you knew whether it was cleaning, drying a saucepan or drying a cup. There was probably a different tea towel depending on which it was. So I grew up in a house where things were regulated, not by me, but by a higher authority who was a full-time working mother and knew exactly what she wanted to see when she came home from work, which wasn't a kitchen, which was Trína Céile, as we say in Ireland. Sorry. Skipped on a bit on my slides there. So, without me maybe realising I had a certain sensibility about how I approach things. I'm not saying my kitchen is as perfect as my mother's, but I definitely don't like clutter or a mess in the kitchen. And that carries through to what I do in work, because we don't leave our personalities behind when we go to work. We bring our personalities with us, and they are part of the risk that we are managing, believe it or not. So the first thing we need to regulate before we regulate any process or equipment is we regulate ourselves and our own behaviour, and we're responsible for ourselves, and we're responsible for our own intellectual integrity above all else. So we're honest with ourselves, what we know and what we don't know. So if you go for an interview and somebody asks you a question at an interview and it's something that's on your CV, but you really go blank and you can't remember, you're always better to say, I'm sorry, could I answer that question later? I really don't know. But if you get to it at the end again, I'll reconsider it and move on. When you're going for any technical job, you're not there to make up the answer on the spot, okay? If you don't know something, you're more honest to put your hand up and say you don't know and don't proceed with that question. But equally, when you do answer a question and you feel, okay, I think I answered what they want to know, there's nothing to stop you asking the interviewer, have I answered your question? And get their feedback. Because basically what you're doing now is you're closing a feedback loop. And you'll know then whether you get the interview or not, at least for that question, did you answer as well as you did? These are all principles that will stand to you in quality if you're working in validation or quality, or in fact just in a GMP setting at all. So I have the 3 degrees there in case you're wondering who those ladies are, because matters of degree matter. Good measurement is extremely important for us to be able to say our systems are in control and compliance. I'm going to have to skip a few slides, I think, because I've been rushed along slightly. But if you have ever carried out a test in any lab or any other setting, at interview, be expected to ask about that test and be expected to justify why that test measures what you thought it measured. So show that you understand the difference between reliability of tests and validity of tests for any test you've ever carried out, and it's going to support you at interview well. Obviously, if you're reading reports or you're presenting data, the more you can present data in a tabular format and the clearer that is, the better. But you also need to realize that behind data are opinions a lot of the time. So data at the end of the day is interpreted, and try and always go back to where the raw data came from. And the reason I'm saying that is because nowadays, and for quite a few years, any tests that are carried out, we must keep that raw data. We can't just present the tests themselves as tables and not archive that data and make it available for auditing, and that's called data integrity. So we want you to be able to combine quantitative and qualitative. So qualitative, as I said, is about what's critical. And quantitative is making sure that we understand and have the data to back up what we consider cause-effect relationships, and where something is not maybe a cause-effect relationship but is correlated to some degree. So your science background will be very useful, or your engineering background will be very useful. Particularly scientists and engineers working together for validation has the best effect. So you may be wondering, right, am I cut out? And as I said, you could be cut out from validation from birth for all we know. But if any of these things resonate with you, well, then it could well be the career direction for you. I won't read down through them, but we have a principle of quality by design, which is very similar to right first time, which is if we start something well, that's half the battle of getting things the way we'd like them to be in GMP. So if you take pride in starting projects well and you plan and prepare particularly well, that's a trait that is very useful to us. And it's also something that drives your job satisfaction. You'd probably be happier in a GMP setting than maybe another setting where things are done in what we call a just-in-time fashion. In pharma, our philosophy is just in case rather than just in time. It's not doing things quickly for the sake of it. It's doing the right thing for the right reasons and being able to support and justify those. So we take people and we train them from lots of different other industries: electronics, aviation, aeronautics, oil and gas. We've paleontologists working with us who are brilliant in validation because they've worked in geosciences where systems thinking is actually very important. And we've had lots of grads come through and do our program and now work for us. You do need a level 8 qualification in a technical subject, but it's, we can consider quite a broad range of subjects. This is an outline of our program. So on the left, I think it's your left, yes, on the left, we need to understand the quality regulations. They are the framework and the context that we're working in. So your contextual judgment, first of all, needs to take these into account. We'll train you from a technical skills point of view, particularly in equipment, process and cleaning validation. And then from a business point of view, we need to train you to be effective in industry. So we'll help you to develop your time management, your project management skills by working on projects for us. These are the companies where we have validation engineers working. So we hire you, you're our permanent employee, but then you spend time on projects in any of these companies. And we match you to the best learning environment for you as a person. People learn in different ways and at different paces and need to be matched up to a manager that will support that. So we do our best. If you're interested, I'm just there in the corner stand for the day, so come up and talk to me. I'd love to talk to you.